You may have heard John Donne's words before we dive into his actual poetry. You may have heard some of his words before. He's got a few famous lines that have lasted throughout the years. No man is an island. If you've heard that phrase, it's basically cliche now, but he's the one who wrote it first. And also, never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Ernest Hemingway's World War I book has the title, For Whom the Bell Tolls. So, you may have heard some of these other pieces of language. We talked about that with Hamlet last time, how his words and phrases have dominated the English language. Donne isn't quite like that, but you may have heard some of his language before. But actually a piece of writing that I actually enjoy almost as much as his poems is this short, it's an excerpt from a sermon actually. It's called Expostulation 19, very fun title. But notice what he says. It says, "My God, thou art a direct God, but thou art also a figurative, metaphorical God too. Thou givest the same word for our satisfaction and for our inquisition, for our instruction and for our admiration. How often, how much more often, doth thy Son call himself a way and a light and a gate and a vine and bread than the Son of God or of man? How much oftener doth he exhibit a metaphorical Christ than a real, a literal, to make their accesses to thee in such a language, such a kind of language, as thou wast pleased to speak to them in a figurative, in a metaphorical language." We might often think of poetry, if you've read in high school or over the years, as, oh, it's just these poets, these writers trying to be fancy, using their clever language and trying to paint these pictures in our minds. That why don't they just get to the point? Just tell us what you want us to know. That's sometimes a fair argument. But what Donne definitely realizes is that it's not just people who try to get their message across using metaphorical, symbolic language. God does as well. And so if we're to understand what it means to be a human, if we're to understand what it means when messages are written down for us, we can't just live in a literal world. We have to know how metaphors and symbolism and figurative language actually work, because that's how God speaks to us a lot of the time. We mentioned in Hamlet, remember what Hamlet says to Horatio, my favorite line, "There's more to this world, Horatio, than what's found in your natural philosophies." And he meant sciences, right? There's more. It's not just facts. It's not just science that defines truth. There's other forms of truth. And in fact, sometimes those truths are more truth than the truth you think is truth. Let me give you a quick example. Just to follow up with Donne's explanation of God and Christ here. We might think in terms of the facts of who Jesus was. We say, well, he was a man. He was born in Bethlehem. He had a dad named Joseph. Okay, those are all fair. Those are truthful facts. Got it. All right. But when we hear Christ described as the Lamb, yeah, it's metaphorical language. But in fact, knowing that he's the Lamb is more useful to us than knowing what town he was born in. There's actually more truth for us in how we interact with the world and then how we learn to love Christ by using the metaphorical language. When we know that he's a sacrificial person, that he spilled his blood, that he died for all of us, so he's the capital L Lamb, right? That's actually more meaningful to us than the factual details of his life sometimes. So when we speak in these metaphorical pieces of language, I know it can be frustrating. You're like, what is this person talking about? Why are they being so, off the wall creative? Perhaps the poet is trying to speak to you a truth that a fact or a piece of scientific evidence just can't quite cover. Maybe the metaphor is more truthful than the real thing. Think of a chair, right? Yeah, I can label it as a chair. I can say it's made of metal and wood. Well, then it's also made of elements and molecules and atoms and whatever's lower than atoms. Those are all scientifically truthful facts. But that chair becomes a lot more important to me when I've been standing on my feet all day, or I've been walking for miles and miles and I'm weary and I need a place to rest. Suddenly, talking about a chair in those terms is more important than calling it a chair made of wood and metal. So there's more to this world than just the facts. There's other forms of truth, and I think that's what Donne knew, and he explained it literally to us, but he also uses it in his poems, and so that's what we need to be looking for when we read his poetry. He does all this for the sake of truth, which is what I just said. And he viewed the pursuit of truth as not an easy path. He didn't believe that faith should come easy, or that you should just accept everything, or that it's some emotional reaction. Not that that's not possible, but he viewed faith as an intellectual exercise. He viewed it as a struggle up a hill. On a huge hill, cragged and steep, truth stands. And he that will reach her about must go. And what the hill's suddenness resists, wins so. Hard deeds, the body's pains, hard knowledge too, the mind's endeavors reach. I would assume that in your other classes, and I know for sure in this class, and I know for sure in my classes, our job is to find truth, but truth is sometimes, it's difficult. Maybe it's supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be a mental struggle. Maybe our faith isn't supposed to be quite so easy. But if we want to find the truth, you've got to go through that process. And Donne knows that as well as anybody, and we're going to see that in his literature. So even though we're going to read fancy language and cool word pictures, ultimately we're always seeking the truth. So, who is this guy that has this view of the world and does what he does? Well, like I said, Donne's a pretty interesting guy, and whenever you just search him as a person and look for images, these are about the only two that come up. I don't know exactly how accurate they are, but these seem to be the only two paintings that maybe survived of John Donne. And I use both of them because Donne had sort of two different parts of his life that are quite obvious. There's the younger version. He's sort of this dashing, cool, traveling man. And then there's the wiser, older, more sophisticated priest that produces a lot of the sonnets that we're going to read today. But Donne was born into a Catholic household when Catholicism was illegal. Much of the history of England and Western Europe was a back and forth between is Catholicism legal or is Protestant the official religion of Western Europe or of England specifically. So he was born and was raised in a time in which Protestantism was the only faith. Now, keeping in mind that this is all Christianity, but they're more specific than that. No, you cannot be of the Catholic faith. So his father was Catholic. That proved to be rather difficult, and of course he grew up Catholic. His father passed away when he was only 4. He had a brother who was imprisoned and died of the plague in prison. He had other friends who were killed early and died or were sent to prison or were punished harshly. So he had a bit of a rough early life, but he was also rather intelligent. He went to school in various places, and he became fairly well-traveled in his younger years. But because of his Catholicism, you can go to some schools, but you can't technically graduate from them. So he basically finished all his schooling without ever receiving a diploma because it wasn't allowed to be handed to people non-Protestant. He also went to law school for a time, and similar situations happened. He wasn't officially licensed because he wasn't the right faith. But he like I said, he traveled a lot for his schooling and spent a lot of time in various points in Western Europe, and was a bit of a wild man by all accounts. He liked the ladies. He liked having a good time. He definitely had a free spirit. But once he turned about 25 and he came back to England, he started to change his life a little bit. He decided to move away from his Catholicism. He accepted the Protestant faith that was dominating England, which led to a few more opportunities for him. But he had felt discrimination in many ways, in many of his job opportunities. So he has his personal struggles that he's going through. He also then, when he's about 29, he marries his wife, of course, his only wife. But she dies at age 33, even though he lives to almost 60. And they have 12 children. But along the way, he sees two of them are stillborn, so they don't even make it. 3 of them die before the age of 10, and another girl dies before she's 18. So he actually watches 6 of his own children out of the 12 die along with his wife, who dies at 33. So this is a guy who's faced some tragedy and hardship in his life, and yet he he still stays with the faith, but we can see on the page how those struggles kind of overwhelm him at times. But Donne is a very interesting guy with an interesting life story, eventually becoming a very successful preacher. He becomes the priest of a Maine cathedral and publishes hundreds of sermons, and we're only getting some of the most famous of his writings. He was quite a prolific writer of not only poetry but other forms of essays and sermons as well. So we see on the right the more distinguished kind of elder figure that John Donne eventually became, but he was not always that way. One of his poems that seems to reflect his youth a little bit more is a famous one you may have read in high school. I don't know if you read it in high school, but it's in other textbooks. It's called The Flea, and it's essentially about a guy trying to convince a girl to sleep with him. It's a very, very crafty little poem here. In the 3 stanzas, he essentially uses a bug to make a parallel that, if this bug bites both of us and it has both of our blood in the bug as it walks around creeping on the floor, it has our lives and our blood mixed together. That's actually more serious than if the 2 of us were to hook up. After all, we're not mixing blood. We're not mixing our whole lives together. We're just going to enjoy ourselves for a little while. And by the end, when the young lady squashes the bug and essentially he says, well, you've killed 3 things. You killed the bug, you've killed me, and you've killed you because we were inside that bug. Look at the things you've done. What we're about to do, it's not as big a deal as that, so don't worry about it. So as a younger man, we don't know exactly the publication date of this, but we can assume this was probably written in his younger years before he eventually writes sort of different types of poems once he gets married especially. But he doesn't necessarily lose some of his erotic imagery. If you read some of his other poems, he discusses those things quite often, perhaps not as explicitly as this, but it's an interesting contrast between the poems we're going to read today and this one that's also quite famous.